and today we have concluding remarks on fighting in God's way. This is part 8. 1. The act of shahada and shahid are conceptually entirely different from the acts of fighting, qital, killing, qatl, and the subject of death, maut. Nobody can be called a shaheed if he is not alive and therefore unable to declare his shahada publicly. The shuhada are those who, just like the siddiqun, prophets, and salihun, have public witness against injustice and even suffer. And those who, just like the siddiqun, I repeat, siddiqun, prophets, and salihun, give public witness against injustice and even suffer for it by incarceration, or give witness to a major scientific discovery. An example, new medicines that are first tested on themselves, or reported under danger about world-changing events as journalists. In all instances, regardless of whether they are killed during their witness or not, to call people killed in a war shuhada is a political ruse by Machiavellian politicians. Governments and army generals know only too well that they have sent young men to their certain death. They cannot do anything for those who are killed. But in order to encourage more people to go to war, they invent stories about an easy entry to paradise and about beautiful maidens who will serve the killed martyrs in the garden. These are naturally just empty promises because Allah alone can decide on such matters, not politicians. It is for life, not death, that God created the acts of shahada, and of the shaheed. But the political caste and the religious establishment has conflated shahid with qital and qatl, that is, with fighting and death. It has created the collective mindset in which the life of a human being does not count for much, and wherein lies a mental numbness in which people seem to be no longer shocked by the number of people killed, even if it is needed alarmingly high. In our feeble mindedness, we boast that foreign armies employ spineless soldiers who are psychologically unable to sustain high casualty. For shock and awe, we send our young men to certain death, hoping to produce the highest number of casualties possible. We completely ignore the fact that the so-called feeble-mindedness of Western armies can be explained by their value for human life and the regarding the death of each single soldier as a tragic loss of life. We forget that in the West, every military action undertaken by the armies require parliamentary consultation and the broad support of the electorate. We find how praiseworthy it is that they treat the life God has given them in a precious gift, which they try to preserve and prolong as long as they can. Now, how bizarre is it, in contrast, that we celebrate and send our zagharid shrills over the whole town or village announcing that we have a martyr and the family when one of us has died in the war. We proudly announce that this is or that young man has now entered paradise, even though this is downright nonsense, because Allah alone is the Lord over hell and paradise, while we know nothing about hell and paradise. How foolish of us it is to claim we have knowledge of such things. Number 2, the concept of abrogation cannot be applied to the verses of military qital. These verses have been given to us as reported on historic events during the Battle of Badr, Uhud, and Khandaq, Tabuk, and the taking of Mecca and Khaybar, and so on. These are stories from Muhammad's life, belonging to the realm of prophethood, not messengerhood. They have therefore no legislative significance. Just like with the stories of Moses, Jesus, and Joseph, there is, of course, a lesson to learn from those who understand. There is in their stories instruction for men endued with understanding. Yusuf 11. The phrase, and this is a warning for such as have eyes to see. Chapter 13, verse 13, implies that these stories are intended to teach, to identify, to admonish, and to warn, but they should not, and this includes the verses of qital in Surah Toba, serve as a basis for human legislation on international war. Number 3, jihad in God's way is one specific kind of the many types of jihad. Also, jihad in God's way is only one aspect of things that can be done in God's way. One may provide food and shelter for a family in God's way. One may travel the earth in God's way. Or one may seek knowledge in God's way. In God's way means according to His method, not for God. Jihad in God's way is a jihad that wants to restore the word of God as Most High. Fight in qital is one form of jihad to achieve this goal. Jihad in God's way is a struggle for the freedom of all people, in particular for the freedom of religion, free choice in deciding which rituals to practice and which religious doctrine to adhere to. A struggle for freedom breeds free-minded people, and free-minded people are those who care for the justice and equality that we need so badly in the Arab Muslim world. 4. Fight, qital, can be legally justifiable and still not be in God's way. One may fight an opponent in God's way, qital fi sabilillah, in a peaceful contest, pursuing one's own material and intellectual interest. If, however, the contest gradually turns into a fierce battle that cannot be resolved by peaceful means, such a fight in God's way turns into an ordinary fight, al-qital. Most wars in the history of humankind have originated and developed like this. Number 5, fight, qital, can be legal in the events of an external invasion and foreign occupation, and self-defense in such cases does not need permission for anyone, by anyone, because the defense of a nation is pure self-defense. Number 6, the protection of the life and the safety of the population in any state, and defense of the territorial boundaries of a nation state against external invasion are regulated by international law and are covered by the martial code of each individual state. Wars between entire armies cannot be defined as in God's way, unless they are designed to liberate a population that suffers under the ubudiyah, slavery, of a repressive regime that suppresses freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and violates human rights openly. Very few wars in the history of humankind have been led in order to achieve such goals. 7. Jihad in God's way is always peaceful. In certain circumstances, it might be necessary to turn jihad into a fight, qital, in God's way. In this case, it is a kind of fighting jihad that is fought to ensure freedom of choice for all people, in particular freedom of religion. This is a code only for the individual, not for the groups, armies, or entire nations. Number 8, the book does not contain a doctrine that regards humans as slaves of God. Human beings in this life, including believers and unbelievers, Muslim assenters and God dissenters, the pious and the impudent, are all worshippers of God, ibad, if they choose to worship God. Only in the next life are they God's slaves, abid. When slavery exists in this world, it always means subservience to someone other than God. Even though Arab Muslims for centuries have been told that they are slaves of God, to the effect that today they believe that this is what their religion wants them to be, in reality they have been tricked into a kind of slavish obedience to someone other than God. Over a long period of time, acquiescence has become second nature for Arab Muslims, and the mentality of political surrender has become fixed in their mind. The hangman ruler who tyrannizes his own people has, by this logic of surrender, become the epitome of a national hero. We believe that there is no other nation in this world where this type of ubudiyah, oppression, has been so willingly and most enthusiastic, pardon me, enthusiastically embraced as the Arab nation. I'm starting again. That is why, sadly, people do not think that a jihad for the freedom of expression is a cause worth fighting for. This is why the call for a fight for the liberation of all people, regardless of their religious affiliation, is still very alien to them. The corollary of this slavish mentality is the sense of inferiority Arab Muslims have when faced with their own heritage, their traditions, and the people who represent the Arab past. For them, the past per se is superior to everything they think and do today. However, a person who feels like a dwarf vis-a-vis Ibn Abbas cannot act like a giant vis-a-vis the President of the United States. If he feels like a dwarf in comparison to someone in the distant past, he will also feel like a dwarf when faced with someone in the present. True, we vilify the West and abuse it with strong language, and yet the actual situation in our countries perpetuates our ubudiyah towards the West. The West has hegemony over everything, so much so that it can silence our protests and futile outcries. Regrettably, all Arab regimes of whatever nature seem to be more aware of this than their own people. I predict, therefore, a long life and much stability for these regimes, because our culture totally defies a peaceful and democratic revolution against the political authorities. If revolts occur, they are almost always accompanied by the dreadful night of long knives, revenge killings, retaliations, assassinations, and bombing that kill hundreds of innocent people. The path of the Arabs is a cul-de-sac. We fear that the international community will not bet on a losing horse. And we can only hope that if Arab regimes do not see the need to reform themselves, they are pressurized to do so from outside. Number 9, we will not solve the problem of violence by simply giving more power to the security services. Such measures only have a temporary effect, like sedatives, because diseases require a surgical operation. To remove the root cause of this illness requires a revision of the entire foundation upon which Islamic fiqh is based, and of the legal parameters that the fuqaha has invented. Concepts of personal freedom and love of life are not rooted in Islamic fiqh. This revision cannot be done without the creation or adoption of a new epistemological system that is not hijacked by a notion of sacrality belonging to past or by sacrosanct scholarly traditions. For more than 40 years, our main concern has been to prosper and apply such a new epistemological system. Half-baked compromises that stop short of a full revision are not good enough. Perfunctory proposals that do not tackle the root of the crisis, such as the idea of a moderate Islam or of a rapprochement between the different legal schools, are, for us, an opportunity lost. 10. Most urgently, the concept of jihad and qital need to be revised. In the past, they were based on dichotomist model by which the Ummah of Kufr was opposed to the Ummah of Islam. The world was divided in purely religious terms into an abode of disbelief, Dar al-Kufr, and an abode of belief, Dar al-Islam. What appears to be a religious conflict was in reality a war over economic interest, territorial gains, and political dominance. Such concept must change between any war between nations, in particular in the current age, does not know winners and losers since all would lose out. The past has shown that religious wars are terribly destructive, and every Muslim believer who thinks that military battles for religion are kind of jihad in God's way has been misled by a murderous criminal ideology. Number 11, to talk about God's rule on earth is naive and theologically contestable. The hakimiyya of God will not provide us with a viable modern state because it is the task of the state to look after the concerns of the people in this life: health system, education, security, economy. Whereas life in the next world should always be the individual's own prerogative. 12. It is not permissible to separate religion from society, but it is logical and pertinent to separate religion from politics. As soon as religion enters politics, a culture of exclusivist claims will spread and poison the relationship between groups and denominations. The many legal justifications for discrimination of other believers in the books of fiqh should be a warning sign for everyone. 13. Democracy is a natural state of human being. Democracy protects the principles of the freedom of choice, free election, freedom of speech, and academic freedom. It projects life in society as a social contract that binds the rules and the citizen. It provides the minimum of procedures to which humans naturally adhere to, for example, the practice of consultation, shura. It has been prescribed in the book as a duty, but its exact modi operandi have been left open because people apply it differently according to their contingent political systems. Unfortunately, Arab Muslims have not produced a single system of consultation that secures the above democratic principles. 14. The Caliphate, with all its despotic credentials, held its political legitimacy until its abolition in 1924. Subsequent political regimes have continued with the Caliphate's despotic tradition but have never gained its political legitimacy. We still lack a new concept of political rule that enjoys unchallenged legitimacy and differs from the notion of caliphates, which hopefully will never return. 15. The so-called Islamic awakening is a big swindle. Instead of an awakened morality, we have gained a culture of hypocrisy, dishonesty, and unreliability. And the more people focus solely on the prayers and rituals, and the more women decide to become muhajjabat, veiled, the more we will observe a decline in order and public morality. 16. The more people turn to the books of fiqh and the manuals of the medieval fuqaha, such as al-Shafi'i, al-Umm, or Ibn Abidin's Hashia, the more people are cut off from their natural disposition as laid out in the book. Applied on the level of society, the more we rely on the political doctrines of our scholars, the more politics will become undemocratic, authoritarian, and in flagrant violation of international laws and universal human rights. 17. Islam and its three basic pillars exist for all people in this world. What Surah Al-An'am prescribed are general human values that are applicable to everyone. An example, the prohibition of usury and the maharim marriage rules. It implies that all must adhere to them, including secularists and liberals, but most importantly, politicians of whatever country. The ethical and moral values of Islam should influence the legal and political spheres of a society, but they should not force religion into politics in the sense that state and government rules in favor of just one religious community and discriminate against others. Religious rituals should remain untouched by human legislation, inasmuch as the state's concern for the material, this worldly welfare of its citizens should not be affected by theological aspirations of one specific religious group. Even if all of the political party's followers are devout religious, this party should not just promote the interests of one specific imam, but must care for the interests of all people based on the ideals of Islam. 18. It is morally, theologically, and intellectually dishonest to declare suicide mission to be part of istishhad, promising young men and women the status of a shaheed, a martyr. But no one but God is allowed to take life. Suicide bombings are against all rules of military combat and competition that requires the existence of two opposing sides. It is a task of humankind to prolong life, not to shorten it by whatever feeble justification. The real act of istishhad does not take place on the battlefield, but in the courtrooms of civil magistrates and in police stations where statements of living witnesses are given. Suicide missions are merely imitations of the Japanese kamikaze pilots who crashed to their deaths. This is alien to anything that Islam stands for. Islam is a religion of life, not of death. Number 19. The scholars are spreading a mentality of conformism, which persuades the masses to do what they are told by their religious leaders. They do not want to hear critical questions from their followers and prefer their brains to be completely switched off. They encourage the proliferation of the herd instinct, which make people feel insecure when they are not cuddled up into the warmth of group conformity. People behave like sheep who hurry into mainstream thinking at the bark of the shepherd's dog. The mullahs, the imams, the leaders of the sectarian groups. It will require an intellectual revolution to change this mentality of conformity and promote individuality and originality in thought and practice by both the men in the street and the most ordinary Sharia student. Loyalty in Islam is next.